Okay, I'm here with Craig Davidson, the author of The Saturday Night Ghost Club, our One Book on London selection for this round. I have a couple questions for Craig. What would you like Londoners to know about The Saturday Night Ghost Club?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I'd like them to know, it's really like most authors. It's a book, in some ways, for me, based a lot on my own childhood, my own growing up in Niagara Falls and in that area. And really it was a great fun to write because it was fun to kind of go back to my own childhood and kind of investigate, if not investigate, kind of relive on the page some of those formative aspects of my life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, in the setting, Niagara Falls, 1980s, must have evoked lots of memories for you and been really fun to write about, especially I feel like there's a lot going on with that nostalgia, the
Yes.
1980s nostalgia, especially.
It feels
Stranger
like
Things
lately, like Stranger Things, obviously,
Yeah.
it's kind of become a classic over a very short span of time, and I think it's a lot of it is that the creative people who were born in that generation are now coming of age creatively. They're in their 30s and 40s.
Yes.
In the same way that some of the, I was really influenced by. I'd written the book before Stranger Things even came out, so I was influenced more by the, say, John Blair's, Wilson Rowell's, Stephen King's,
Yep.
The Body, obviously, Dandelion Wine, Robert R. McCammon's Boy's Life. So I was influenced by those kind of coming of age narratives, both filmic and book, that I read growing up, and sort of for a writer. I guess you kind of have a bucket list, most of us. We want to write this type of novel,
Mm-hmm.
this type of novel. So I really always had this in mind to write a coming-of-age narrative, and so this was my shot at that.
Yeah. And how does it feel to have our whole city reading your book together and sharing it and engaging with it?
Well, it's a lot of pressure. No, but it's a lovely opportunity, and I really I'm grateful, to have this initiative, because certainly not every library system does something like this. So for any author to have an entire community be focused on a book that you've written is really meaningful, and I'm grateful for it.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you and to be
Thank
reading it. So you're writing, your breadth of writing sort of crosses lots of genres. You've written nonfiction, fiction, you write horror under your pseudonym.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned a coming-of-age novel, so how would you categorize a Saturday Night Ghost Club? How would you sort of, what would be the genre?
Yeah, it's strange. I think, it's one of those kind of eye of the beholder type things.
Mm-hmm.
I think some people might even say it has a certain YA-ness to it. And a lot of the really great coming-of-age novels that I read probably do actually have, because ultimately you're trying to get into the headspace of a preteen.
Yeah.
Which is one of the things when I did remember writing this is that. So my wife and I have a 7-year-old son, and like some of the stuff that he comes up with, the way that he sees the world, is completely his own, not just his own, but that of his time and place in the world.
Yes.
As a 7-year-old, and so I think that being a 12-year-old is the same thing. And I think for me, when I was in my 30s trying to write this book, you can get close to that. You think you can anyways, but really trying to you don't think in the same way. There's some process that happens emotionally and mentally in becoming an adult,
Mm-hmm.
and that you kind of lose that ability to see the magic in the world to a degree. You can remember it. You can almost remember your sense of remembering it, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
But you can't actually. You go through this metamorphosis where you kind of lose that, and so it was fun. Ultimately, I knew I couldn't quite get there, and
Mm-hmm.
in the way that probably no writer can actually get to that point in their youth. But that didn't mean it wasn't enormously fun to go back and try and reconnect with that old self of mine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's such an interesting time in people's lives to be writing about. I remember, that time of starting to realize that things aren't the way you think they
Yeah.
are, and the things that your parents have told you maybe aren't the way you think they are, and that family history and all that side
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah.
So it's a super interesting time period, and I think everyone will relate to that time.
And it's
for
sort of
sure.
a necessary kind of disburdening of certain childhood beliefs. Like it's very, the character of Calvin in the book, for example, is almost in some ways the most childlike of the whole book, even though he is an adult.
Yes.
And I've always said too, he's probably, of any character I've ever written, he's probably the most fantastical, because the idea that any character, any person could go through that crucible of teenagehood and come out still somewhat believing in the things that they believed in as a child is like almost an impossibility, because we all kind of have to change. It's like a necessary adjustment.
Yeah.
So the idea of being able to maintain that kind of viewpoint of the world as almost impossible as it is, it was again a fun to imagine a character who saw the world in some ways fundamentally the same way he did as a kid.
Yes, yeah, and that was really interesting to have them be sort of in the same mindset, but two completely different people and different experiences. Speaking of Uncle Calvin, what do you think that Uncle Calvin leaves the reader thinking about? Like, what do you hope that people take away from his character and his experience?
That's a great question, and it's as you know, having read the book, it's probably a fairly complex question in terms of, because I think some people would read the book and see his being as a fairly sad story, and I think it is somewhat of a sad story. But I think it's also a story of like there's a certain deep resiliency of a person like that, and I mean, he might not even be aware of just how resilient he is.
Yes.
And so I think, you know, he's a conflicted character. I think just in his conception, he has to be a very conflicted character, and he's kind of bifurcated. He's really two people, and one doesn't know who the other one is really without spoiling too much. But that was, some people often say, what was the root of wanting to write this or that story? And I think for me, his conception, who he was, what he was dealing with, came before any of the other childhood portions about the Jake and the Yellowbirds and any of that. That kind of was that was built off of the foundation of wanting to investigate Calvin's story.
Yes, yeah, and I think he is a side character, but ultimately, yeah, like you say, there is that resilience, and you don't feel sad for him because he doesn't know he doesn't understand it.
He doesn't know himself. He doesn't
really exactly.
Yeah.
He's not sad. So we're not sad for him.
I think one of the characters says something like he's a stranger to himself.
Yeah.
And he is in some ways a stranger to himself. He didn't even really, maybe you could say he didn't really have anything to do with that. That was something, a process in his mind and memory that was a safety mechanism that kind of flicked on, that was a self-preservation mode. But yes, no, I hope he's not he's somewhat a tragic character, but I certainly enjoyed writing him, and I didn't see him as a sad figure. If anything, I saw him as a certain avatar of human resiliency to continue persisting despite great tragedy.
Yes, absolutely. As an author, what kind of opportunities do you think an initiative like One Book One London or similar citywide reads can bring to a city?
Can bring to a city? Well, that's a great question. I think I certainly know to bring to an author, it's a great, wonderful opportunity to bring to a city. I think literacy and the library, obviously for a writer, library, we know how important and impactful libraries are. Not just to our careers, but like most writers have grown up around libraries and have fond memories of how the library was influential to us in our maturation, how we became who we are, how we fell in love with the written word. I remember being in libraries much like this one, maybe not quite as grand as this, but in lovely libraries, and squirreled away in a corner, and just reading books. Sometimes I'd have a stack. Sometimes I'd take them home. Sometimes I'd just read them there, and then leave them and come back the next day and hope someone had checked them out, sort of a thing.
Yeah.
But I think sort of the value of libraries in modern times is, I think some people maybe take it for granted, I guess, and probably not the people who are going to enjoy this program. But in general, I think anything that kind of can inspire literacy and inspire people to maybe reconnect with the library if they happen to have found other ways to get themselves reading. Our family's huge into the library, and ideally lots of people, ideally, that programs like this foster that kind of, if there has been a point where people have stepped away from the library, they're like, oh wow, libraries are really trying to reconnect with the community.
Yes.
And through programs like this are probably one of the best ways of fostering that connection.